There was a trafficking act that was passed that actually kept the Flores settlement alive as part of its regulatory authority. So what the real story is behind this this whole overarching story of both the psychotropic drugs and the treatment of children in facilities at the southern border is what's going to happen with this Flores settlement. Is it going to be actually implemented as a federal rule? Is the government going to get sued again for violating it? And how does that turn out, since it currently is in effect, both through the original settlement that was reached as well as through the 2008 Trafficking Act? Another thing that I wanted to point out is that when we're talking about the administration reuniting children with their parents, one of the difficulties is that there isn't really any way to contact these parents that have been deported, right? There's not really ways to contact whatever family members they may have here. And I hesitate to play devil's advocate in any scenario, but if you can imagine a situation where you're a parent of children, the government has taken your children away from you and maybe deported you, would you give that government your phone number?
They had my children.
They had my kid.
Yeah.
If they had my kid, I might.
But if you have other family members that are trying to immigrate, do you want this government to reach you? And generally, even immigration attorneys say no. There has historically not been a practice of the government keeping track of many types of immigrants when they're not specifically in detention, whether they're in the country immigrating legally or out of the country attempting to immigrate legally. And part of that is because the government should not have that information. So that's one thing I would add to it. The fact that the government can't reunite families may be part of a broader general policy of not having this contact information for a reason, which is that it should not.
They can't be trusted with it. Yeah.
Right, and which is where, with the ACLU stepping in, the ACLU is here saying, we'll do what we can, but the government has better resources than we do. That's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it is better to trust it to a non-governmental authority than to the people who are separating families, putting them in terrible facilities,
That's true, yeah.
and so on. So that's the only other thing I would point out. Additionally, one thing that I think people get confused about is that it is not illegal to come to the border and try to immigrate without prior plans in place. There's a difference between being an asylee and being a refugee. When you're a refugee, you apply from outside of the country, you get all your paperwork in advance, and then you come with a placement. When you're an asylee, you show up at the border with what you have on your back, with who you're with, and you claim asylum at that point. And so that is not illegal immigration. That has been historically recognized as a form of legal immigration into this country for decades. What we talked about earlier about having a system of immigration, whether you like it or not, there needs to be a system, and this is currently the one we have. It is completely federal, so it changes administration to administration, but throughout administrations, the right to claim asylum at the border is a historical right.
Mm-hmm.
And it should probably continue to be that way just based on volatile world conditions, right? Like there's a war suddenly in one country, people come here and claim asylum, and I think that's probably the right way it should be.
Right, and so to claim claim asylum,
Yes.
you basically go to a port of entry.
Yep.
And you claim asylum, and then you enter in legally, and then bring your case to a judge or.
Yep,
or
and so
however.
you do get certain rights right away, but you're not just automatically granted citizenship or anything. You're not automatically granted residency. You
Right.
do have to take your case before an immigration court and prove up your claim of asylum.
Right.
However, you do get entry. So I think that's the distinction that people make.
It isn't what they were charging them with, not that they're entering from a port, but they were entering from an access that was not a port of entry, and therefore it was crossing the border illegally,
Right, and
not being in the country illegally.
And that's a separate issue,
Yep.
but I think that people still forget that one of our biggest borders is airports.
Right.
People forget that those are borders and that there's illegal
Right.
immigration in Minneapolis through the airport. There's illegal immigration at every airport, and it's not usually the people at the southern border, right? It's
Mhm.
So
people
this wall
coming
that
from...
they're proposing is completely
Right.
preposterous.
Right, it's people from other
Right.
countries, European countries, coming here entering on a visa, overstaying their visa, thereby
Right.
becoming an illegal
And
immigrant.
the issue is that they're crossing the border not at a port of entry,
Yes.
making it illegally crossing the border, which they then take to a criminal proceedings,
Right.
and that's when the children get separated.
Correct.
Now, one of the things that the ACLU has brought up, and many immigration attorneys have brought up, news organizations have found this too, is that at ports of entries they were denying access to people who were seeking asylum, therefore making it so that they really had no other choice than get a misdemeanor, what was a misdemeanor charge, which is fine, but then being able to claim asylum when you're actually in the United States, and that's so that to me is what's the pretty egregious within this whole
So
story.
what goes on in that interim? So if you enter to a port of entry legally, seeking asylum, and you have to wait to have your case heard, to argue about your asylum status, what happens in that interim?
You're able to work and get a job. Any person who is working on a permit in the United States is also paying taxes on that, even if they're not a citizen, which a lot of people also don't realize. But generally speaking, what happens is a person with a claim for asylum is working to try to prove up their case in that time, which would include establishing that they cannot return to their country for fear of persecution or death. And asylum is relatively difficult to establish. There's been a lot of different types of cases that have been found not to establish a valid asylum claim. In some cases, gang rape as a part of war is not a valid asylum claim, which is horrifying. Asylum is a really tough area of law. If you ever want to have just a podcast on immigration itself, I know a ton of immigration attorneys who would come on. One, Carolina, I worked with at the immigration law firm that I worked at prior to law school, and she was doing refugee representation or airport representation when the travel ban was first initiated. And so she's been doing a lot of work in that area, and she's gone down to the detention center in Dilley, Texas, to work with mothers and children who are being detained there, to try to get them out so that they're not just sitting in this detention center in 110-degree heat in Texas year-round. So that's why I encourage everyone to take immigration law, because even understanding how the different, like what ICE does versus CIS versus Border Patrol, is kind of hard to do in the grand scheme of things. The Department of Homeland Security was not meant to make it easier to understand versus INS. So immigration is a tough area of law, and it changes rapidly. So it's a good class to take if you can.
Yeah. Quick plug. I will say something positive for once. For U of M students, first years, there's something called the Asylum Law Project, which I had a lot of classmates had a really positive experience with, and you take a trip either over your winter break or your spring break and work on these asylum projects, and so you should look into it if you are a 1L at the U. Also, abolish ICE is my last point.
Thanks, Anna.
Yep.
Yep. All right.
Also abolish borders, countries, nations, the whole thing. Thank you for listening to the Cold Call Lawcast. Follow us on social media at Cold Call Lawcast. There's 3 L's in a row, just so you know. Cold Call ends with 2 L's, and then there's another L at the beginning of Lawcast. It looks really cool. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Ask us any question you'd like, and we'll answer it on our next episode, maybe. We'll see you next time. Also, quick plug to our friend Seth. He does the music. You can reach him at SethTracyMusic@gmail.com. Check out his bands, stuff like that. You know what I do with the
Why
guys
does-
that I used to date?
Not podcasts, I bet.
You don't do you podcast with the guys you used to date?
No, I paint decks, date their friends.
With them? Or
Yeah, move in as roommates.
Date your boyfriend's friends?
I did once. I mean, they were like best friends in high school.
Oh,
And
That's
we were
even
all
worse.
friends. We were all friends.
were
And
makes
I
it sound
dated
like
one
did you break it up?
For like 2 months, senior year of high school, and then the other friend I dated like 3 years later.
Okay,
It
there's
was
a
not
there's
that
a time in
When,
there.
after we had both moved to Arizona, it was like not that weird. But then we did all end up moving in together as roommates. after
The
that.
three of you all moved in together.
Yeah.
Oh my god!
It was
That-
great, actually.
That's
God.
a fun
So
fact
this
right
is
there.
actually
Remember-
way more normal than that.